Hey there, and welcome. Tonight we're traveling back in time, not to the battlefield or the throne room, but to something quieter, more personal. We're going to explore what a wedding truly meant in the Middle Ages. This isn't a tale of fairy tale gowns or modern-day romance. It's about land and legacy, family ties, whispered vows, and the quiet rituals that shaped lives in stone chapels and village greens. Whether it was a noble alliance sealed with feasts and parchment, or two peasants joining hands with nothing more than bread, salt, and a prayer, marriage in medieval times was about much more than love. Over the next 2 hours, we'll walk through those forgotten customs, step into the candlelit halls where promises were made, and listen to the soft echoes of vows that carried weight long after the ceremony ended. So get comfortable, let the day fall behind you, and drift into the rhythms of a distant world, one where every wedding told a story. And if you enjoy this journey through the past, feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. I always love seeing the quiet corners of the world we gather from. Now, let's begin. The quiet promise before the vows. It began, more often than not, without ceremony, not in a chapel, not before a priest, but around a hearth or near the village well, or on a walk through the fields, just before dusk. There were no flowers, no white gowns, no trumpets sounding from castle towers, just a simple understanding, a promise exchanged in quiet words, shaped more by duty than by romance. In a medieval village, two young people might have known each other since childhood. They'd helped gather hay from the same meadow, filled pails from the same stream. Over time, glances turned to greetings, greetings to laughter, and laughter sometimes to something deeper. But even when feelings stirred, a wedding wasn't just about the two of them. It was about land, and labor, and survival. And so that quiet promise, the one made before any vows were spoken, wasn't only between a man and a woman, it was between families. Sometimes, even between entire households or farms. An agreement that two lives would soon become one. These promises were shaped by seasons. In spring, when the soil softened and the lambs bleated through the morning mist, new matches would often be whispered about. That family by the oak ridge had a strong boy. The widow near the chapel had a daughter old enough to wed. Soon the talk would grow, slow and cautious, like seeds under earth. Sometimes a father would approach another father, hat in hand, tone polite, but measured. "Your daughter seems kind," he might say. "My boy's a steady one." It might begin with small things, a loaf of bread offered at market, a shared cup of ale after mass. And then came the questions. Was there land to pass on? Were there debts to consider? Would both sides agree? For those of noble birth, the conversation was colder. Marriages were arranged far in advance, sometimes before the couple could speak. They were contracts, sealed by names, titles, and claims. But even there, under silk and seal, a quiet promise still existed, however faint. Among the peasants, though, the promise was made in simpler ways. A hand offered to lift a basket, a carved trinket passed in secret, a shared walk home through the frost. There were no formal betrothal ceremonies yet, just mutual intention, two people seen more often together, a mother smiling knowingly, a neighbor noticing how the girl's eyes lingered when the boy passed by. No one said much aloud, but the village noticed, always, and soon when the sun sat lower in the sky and the leaves turned or the harvest ended, someone would speak the promise aloud, quietly in front of kin. A decision made, a future begun. There were still many steps ahead, negotiations, blessings, and finally, the vows themselves. But this was where it truly started. In quiet, with no trumpets, no feast, just a simple hope shared between two people, and the subtle shifting of two lives drawing gently toward one. Bread, salt, and a handshake. The first formal step in a medieval marriage often came not in a church, but in a home, over a wooden table worn smooth by years of meals and mending, warmed by a hearth that never quite stopped burning. There was no parchment, no lawyers, no royal seals. There was bread, there was salt, and there was a handshake. That was enough. In the medieval world, to share bread and salt with another family was more than simple hospitality. It was a gesture of trust, of goodwill, of welcome. Bread, the staff of life, salt, precious and enduring. Together they meant, "We are at peace with you. We honor this bond." When two families gathered to discuss a marriage, they would sit quietly together, often in the bride's household, sometimes under the thatched eaves of the groom's kin. the house would be swept, the fire tended, someone, usually the mother, would bake. The bread was not sweet or decorated, but wholesome, often dark and coarse, made with barley or rye. The salt, a pinch from a treasured little jar near the hearth. It had travelled far to be there, carried from coastal salt pans or drawn from ancient wells, and so, before any terms were spoken aloud, the families would break bread. They would pass it with weathered hands, sprinkle it with salt, eat together in quiet. Because before vows were given, and before rings were exchanged, there had to be trust. The young couple might sit nearby, speaking little. The conversation would be between elders, about land and livestock, about labor and future children. These were practical matters, but they were also sacred in their own way. Sometimes a gift was offered, not gold or jewels, but something humble and honest. A carved spoon, a woolen shawl, a leather belt hand-stitched with care. These small things said, "We are ready to join." And when all was spoken and understood, the men would stand, not in arrogance, but in quiet agreement. One hand would reach out, the other would take it. A handshake, firm, still, binding. It was not a legal contract by modern standards, but it was enough to be remembered, witnessed, honored. In some regions, this was the betrothal itself. In others, it was a prelude. But always, it carried weight. After this, to break the promise was a shame, not just for the couple, but for the entire household. The village would know. The priest might speak of duty from the pulpit. And so this moment, so simple in gesture, so small in sound, was everything. Bread, salt, a handshake. Not for show, not for story, but for the building of a life. A village learns of a match. The news didn't come with any formal announcement. There were no letters read aloud, no bells rung, and certainly no town criers. Instead, it travelled the way most things did in a medieval village, quietly, step by step, word by word. It began with a small detail. A mother at the well who mentioned that her daughter would be helping bake a second loaf today. A boy spotted mending the fence that ran between two family plots. A father who visited the neighbor's home not once but twice in a single week. People noticed, they always noticed. The village, small and tight-knit, was a place where time moved gently but with great memory. Everyone knew everyone, not just by name but by voice, by gait, by the way they handled a hoe or passed a jug of ale. Any change, stood out. So when two families began to spend more time in one another's company, the village noticed, not out of nosiness, really, but because marriage wasn't just about two people, it was about the flow of daily life, of land, labor, and kinship. Who someone married could affect the balance of everything, from where goats grazed to who harvested, whose oats. It was the old women who usually caught on first. They might sit at the edge of the green shelling peas into a wooden bowl or spinning flax while talking quietly. One might raise an eyebrow and say, "I saw young Thomas walking beside Edric's girl again," not accusingly, just stating the shape of things as they were beginning to form. The children, too, noticed things, especially if there was teasing to be had. A younger brother might giggle when he saw his sister wearing a ribbon she normally saved for feast days. A friend might nudge another when the girl with soft eyes handed someone her share of baked apples after Mass, and still no one said anything outright. Not yet. It would build slowly, like clouds forming over the hills, gathering shape as the days passed. The families might begin to share tasks. A borrowed scythe, help with a roof, an extra shoulder during shearing season. These were more than kind gestures. They were signs. In the tavern, someone might casually remark, "Looks like there'll be another wedding before winter," and others would nod, not surprised, just quietly pleased, because in the village, a wedding was a kind of hope, a signal that things continued, that after the harvest, after the hardships, after the endless spinning of seasons, something new would begin. So when the match was understood, when it no longer needed to be said aloud, it was as though the village shifted slightly, preparing itself, a sense of movement under the stillness. The blacksmith might begin shaping an iron cooking hook as a quiet gift. A neighbor might start saving her finest wool scraps for a small shawl. The church remained silent, for now. The priest knew better than to speak too soon. But in his heart, he was already thinking about the blessing he might offer. Nothing official had been signed, no rings exchanged, no feast prepared, and still the match had taken root. It lived in the glances shared in passing, in the smiles of strangers who were no longer quite so strange. in the hush that falls over a village just before the bells ring, not from shock but from the comfort of knowing what's coming next. Betrothal beside the hearth. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't loud. There were no choirs singing, no scrolls being read aloud, no velvet-draped halls, just a small house, likely made of timber and daub, with a thatched roof that creaked in the wind, and a hearth that never truly went cold. This was where most betrothals took place, in the very center of daily life. The hearth was everything. It cooked the meals, dried the boots, warmed the sleeping children, and smoked the meats hung overhead. And on this day, it bore witness to something else. A promise made not to the church just yet, but to family, to community, and to the steady rhythm of village life. A betrothal in the Middle Ages wasn't yet a wedding, but it was a deeply binding moment. In many places, even this early pledge carried legal weight. To break it without cause could mean fines or shame, or worse, a lifelong reputation for dishonor. The couple would sit near the fire, not side by side, but close enough for warmth. Often they were still young, perhaps barely into their teens. Nervous laughter, lowered eyes. The boy might glance at the girl's father more than at her. The girl might keep her hands folded in her lap, picking at her sleeve in silence. The parents did most of the speaking. They talked about expectations, how the households would help each other, what the children would bring into the union. A cow, a small parcel of land, a bundle of wool already promised. Sometimes they'd speak of nothing more than character. He's strong, a father might say, even-tempered. She keeps a clean room, a mother might add. Knows how to spin, and keeps time with the son. That was enough. The promise, when it came, was simple. The couple would be pledged to one another from this day forward. Not yet man and wife, but nearly so, and unless something drastic occurred, the wedding would follow soon, weeks, perhaps months, but usually not long. Sometimes the priest was there, sometimes not. Sometimes the betrothal was sealed with the joining of hands, or the drinking of ale from the same cup, and often a gift was exchanged, a ring if the family could afford it, or more commonly, something practical, a knife, a cloth belt, a length of thread wrapped around a bit of carved wood. It wasn't showy, but it meant everything. When the guests left, if there were guests at all, the fire would still be burning. The couple might stay behind, sitting quietly near the hearth, not quite sure what to say next. The girl might poke at the embers with the fire iron. The boy might stare at the rough beams above their heads, imagining the weight of all that would follow. There would be chores the next day, fields to tend, bread to bake, but that night, things had changed. A promise had been spoken, witnessed, remembered, and the fire, steady and warm, kept burning beside them, as it had for their parents before them, and as it likely would for the children they had not yet met. When two families became one, in the Middle Ages, a wedding wasn't just about love, it was about weaving lives together, not only the bride and groom, but everyone around them. Two families, two households, two ways of doing things, now tied by a single thread, and that thread had to hold. After the betrothal was spoken near the hearth, things began to shift, slowly but noticeably. The girl's brothers might offer help stacking firewood for the groom's family. The groom's mother might bring over a cloth bundle of herbs to help the bride's little sister with her cough. It wasn't announced. No one said, "We are one family now." But it began in these small, careful gestures. People started thinking in twos. That corner of field behind the orchard, it would now feed both homes. The old ewe, ready to lamb, whose hands would tend her, likely both, and the stories once told within each family's circle, now passed between them, shared around benches by firelight. If the two families had been strangers before, there was often a kind of cautious dance. Would they get along? Would old feuds come up? Would someone mention that disagreement over firewood from years back? But most often, necessity smoothed things over. Villagers lived close to the land, and the land didn't wait on pride. A flooded path, a sick ox, an early frost. These things had a way of reminding people what truly mattered. So in most villages, when two young people were betrothed, their families quietly got to work on both the practical and the personal. Sometimes, the two fathers would walk a field together, speaking little, just footsteps in the damp earth, and the occasional nod, maybe even a laugh. Sometimes, the mothers would meet early in the morning to hang laundry on shared lines, discussing nothing of the wedding, but speaking kindly, easily, without effort. That was how it happened, not all at once, but like stitches in a seam, each day drawing the two families closer. There were little preparations everywhere, extra barley put aside, a pig fattened, bits of cloth saved for garments, a small corner of the house cleared, maybe, for when the couple would one day live under that roof. The children noticed too. One family's little ones now chased chickens in the other's yard. An older cousin from the bride's side helped the groom's brother mend a fence. Slowly the boundaries softened, and while no one said it directly, they all understood. These weren't two families anymore. They were becoming one, not just in name or on parchment or in a ceremony yet to come, but in rhythm, in routine, and in the quiet trust that grows when people begin building a life together, piece by piece. Whispers between mothers. In the days after the betrothal, when the fields were quiet and the bread had risen in the pan, there came a moment, small and easily missed, when the women of the two households would find themselves alone together. It didn't happen formally. There was no summons, no set meeting time, just a chore that brought them close, plucking chickens, spinning wool, washing linens down at the stream, and in that time, away from the noise of the men discussing livestock or coin, the women spoke softly. One mother, seasoned by years of marriage and many winters, would glance at the other, younger and new to this crossing of households. She might ask, how does she do with the mornings, meaning the bride-to-be? She rises early, the younger one might answer, keeps quiet, gets her work done, and that would be the start. These weren't idle conversations. These whispers between mothers were the passing of invisible knowledge, things not spoken at the table or inside the chapel. They talked of how to calm a frightened girl on the night before her wedding, of which herbs to steep for a restless stomach, of how to stretch oat flour through lean seasons, of what it meant to live beside a man whose moods were shaped by the weather and the yield of the land. No one took notes, no one called it teaching, but it was, and often woven between the practical advice, came something gentler, a memory, a story, a warning given not harshly, but with tenderness. One mother might say, she's got her own way that one, like I did, it'll serve her if she learns when to bend. The other might reply, he's not his father, he watches things longer before speaking. That can be good, or it can wear on her. Neither of them was trying to control the match, that was already set. But both women understood that the real wedding wasn't the feast or the vows, it was the long days after, when silence could speak louder than words, and care had to be stitched into every corner of a shared life. Sometimes, they'd laugh quietly, share the absurdity of something their husbands had said, shake their heads at the foolishness of youth, and in that moment, they weren't two families negotiating a future, they were simply two women mothers, bridging an old distance with warmth. When the work was done, they didn't hug, didn't linger. That wasn't the way of things, they simply returned to their homes. But from that day forward, there would be a new kind of understanding in how they looked at each other across the village green, or passed bread during a feast. They had shared something, just enough to help their children begin, because before the rings and blessings came the whispers, and sometimes, the whisper of one mother to another was the strongest bond of all. A father's dowry, and a mother's song. Long before the bride walks to the chapel, and long before the feast is laid, there is a kind of work that happens behind closed doors. Quiet work, slow work. The father prepares the dowry, the mother prepares her daughter. In many parts of medieval Europe, the dowry was not just tradition, it was law, expectation, necessity. It was the father's offering, a final act of provision before his daughter stepped into another man's home. And yet it was never just about money. Some fathers gave livestock, 2 goats perhaps, or a cow nearing her first calf. Others offered tools, a small plot of land, or sacks of grain. A few gave coin, if they had it, stored in a leather pouch with a drawstring long frayed from the years. But more often than not, the dowry was simple and deeply personal. A wooden chest, handmade, a knife with his initials on the hilt, a pair of wool-lined shoes for winter, things that could not be replaced easily, because they came not from wealth, but from work. He would bring these items out slowly, sometimes alone in the barn, or beneath the canopy of trees near the edge of his land. He might check the hinges on the chest again, test the blade of the knife, run his thumb across the grain of the wooden spoon he'd carved the year she was born. He didn't say much. Most fathers didn't, but every movement held meaning. Meanwhile, the mother was preparing something else entirely. Her work was not stored in boxes or counted out in coin. It was in the way she combed her daughter's hair at night, and the way she showed her how to mend cloth with a neat, invisible stitch. It was in the songs she sang while kneading bread, old songs passed from one woman to the next, soft and steady, not meant for performance, but for remembering. She might teach her daughter which herbs to keep tucked under a pillow, which prayers to whisper when the house creaked strangely at night. She might tell her which neighbors were quick to gossip, and which ones would lend a hand in hard seasons. There would be no formal lesson, no speech, just shared space. A kind of closeness that could only come when time was short and hearts were full. The daughter, for her part, might listen half distracted, as young people often do, but years later, in her own home, she would remember the way her mother folded a blanket, the hum of that tune at the fire, the way her father's hands lingered on the chest before giving it away, because a dowry, in the end, was more than goods. It was a farewell stitched with pride, and a mother's quiet teaching was more than instruction. It was the thread that kept a daughter strong when the world felt unfamiliar. So when the wedding day finally came, and the cart was loaded, and the house grew still, there was a silence, yes, but there was no emptiness. For a father had given what he could, and a mother had sung her daughter into the next part of her life. The spindle and the plough. Not every wedding needed a priest. In many villages, long before a couple stood in front of an altar, they were already known to be bound by something older and more practical than a blessing, shared labor. The spindle and the plough, two humble tools, said more than any parchment ever could. For the bride, the spindle meant she could spin. She could take raw wool and twist it into thread, fine enough to weave into cloth, or sturdy enough to bind seams in the coldest months. Her skill might clothe a family, furnish a chest, or bring coin at market. Girls learned young. By the age of 7 or 8, many could card wool and keep their fingers working by firelight while their parents slept. On long winter nights, the sound of the spindle turning was a familiar rhythm, like the ticking of time itself. The spindle didn't just mean productivity, it meant readiness. If a girl could spin, she could make, and if she could make, she could contribute, and if she could contribute, she could wed. It was not spoken so plainly, but every mother knew it. A spindle might be gifted at betrothal, carved with care, or tucked in the dowry chest, wrapped in cloth. A girl might spin extra in the weeks before her wedding, preparing cloth, not just for herself, but for the household she was about to join. For the groom, it was the plough. The plough told the world he could work the land, turn soil, sow seed, tend to the rhythms of nature that never paused. Owning a plough was rare, most families shared, but knowing how to guide it, how to work alongside an ox without breaking its pace, that was enough. Boys learned young too. They followed behind their fathers, watching how the earth broke apart. They learned when to sow and when to wait, how to read the clouds, how to patch the harness when leather gave out in the middle of a long row. When a man married, he was expected to provide, and not in words or gestures, but in bread, in barley, in sacks of turnips that would last through January. Sometimes, a man would bring his plough, or the blade, at least to the marriage ceremony itself, not to boast, but as a symbol, a quiet declaration, I can carry my share. Likewise, a woman might bring cloth she'd spun, a blanket stitched with her initials, a small sack of flax, a swaddling cloth for a child not yet born. The spindle and the plough weren't just tools, they were vows made without speaking, because long after the guests had eaten, and the fire had died down, and the music had faded into night, it was these two objects, waiting by the doorway, that would shape the days to come. A man and a woman, thread and earth, creation and cultivation. Two lives, joined not only by love or law, but by the promise to build something, with their hands together. An agreement in the eyes of the church. For centuries, marriage in the countryside followed the rhythms of land, labor, and family. A couple promised themselves to each other in the presence of kin, shared bread and salt, and began a life together. But as time went on, the church began to draw those promises into its own fold. What had once been a private, family affair was now being drawn, quietly, steadily, into the eyes of God. It didn't happen all at once, not with a single rule or a papal decree, but little by little, the church's voice grew louder in matters of love and law. At first, it was about clarity. A priest might be asked to witness the betrothal, not to interfere, but to ensure that both parties gave their consent freely. Consent, after all, became the cornerstone of what made a marriage valid in the church's eyes. It didn't matter if the parents had agreed, or if dowries had changed hands. What mattered, officially, was that the man and woman chose each other. But choice was not always so simple. A village girl might feel pressure from her father. A young man might feel duty more than affection. And so the church, in its teachings, tried to set boundaries. No one was to be forced. No one was to wed in secret. A marriage, they taught, should be public, clear, and blessed. So it became common, especially by the 12th century, for couples to say their vows before the church door, not inside, not yet. But on the threshold, there in the open air, before witnesses, the couple would speak the words that joined their lives. Only after that would they step inside, to kneel before the altar and receive a blessing from the priest. It was a quiet moment. No grand choirs, no golden rings for most. Just the steady voice of a priest, perhaps the rustle of wind through the chapel trees, and the murmured prayers of villagers who gathered to listen. Not everyone followed this form, especially in small villages far from cities. There were still many who wed without priests, who made their promises by firelight and began their lives without any formal ceremony at all. But even then, the church's shadow stretched long. It showed up in sermons. It showed up in the banns read aloud before Mass, announcing who intended to wed, giving the village a chance to speak if something was amiss. It showed up in the quiet council of priests who reminded couples of their duties, to be faithful, to be patient, to raise children in the faith. And over time, marriage became not just a social agreement, but a sacrament, a holy joining, a mirror of divine union. This didn't change the simple bread, or the spindle, or the plough, but it layered something deeper atop the everyday, a sense that even the most modest marriage carried sacred meaning, that love, work and faith were bound together in ways both seen and unseen. And so the chapel doors opened, not wide, not with splendor, but just enough to let a man and a woman pass through, hand in hand, as husband and wife. Vows made without words. Not every vow needed to be spoken. In the Middle Ages, where most lives were measured in harvests and holy days, words held meaning, but so did silence. Especially between two people who had grown up beneath the same skies, walked the same muddy paths, and watched the same seasons pass. Sometimes, the clearest promises were never said aloud. They were made when a boy lingered just a little longer to help a girl carry her basket, when she mended his torn sleeve without being asked, when he left a carved trinket near her door and didn't wait to be thanked. In a world without diaries, without rings for the poor, without wedding planners or paper invitations, love and intention had to live in the spaces between what was said. The gestures mattered, the effort mattered, the waiting mattered. A girl might look at the same boy she'd seen her whole life and one day realize he looked different, older, more serious, quieter. Maybe he didn't speak much, but he showed up when her family's roof needed patching, or when her brother broke his leg and the livestock still had to be watered. And in return she brought his mother herbs for aching joints, sat beside his youngest sister at Mass, made extra bread. These weren't courtships in the modern sense. There were no flowers, no letters, no grand declarations, just time. Time spent near one another, time spent paying attention, and time was everything. Eventually a parent might notice. He's a good worker, her father might say, not with a smile, necessarily. Just observation. She seems strong in spirit, his mother might murmur after seeing the girl sweep out the chapel without being asked. And in the stillness of these observations, a quiet agreement would form. The church might one day require formal vows, and in some places it already did. But long before those rituals, the couple had already made promises. Small, sturdy ones, to show up, to care, to stand beside one another, even if the words hadn't yet found their shape. Not every couple spoke fluently. Some were shy, some barely looked at one another until the day of the wedding. But for many, especially those who had known each other since childhood, the vows began in the shared rhythm of their days, in the way he learned to match her pace when walking, in the way she folded his name into songs she hummed while spinning. And so when the day came to stand before the priest, or the village, or simply their families, what needed to be said had already been lived. Because sometimes the truest vows are not shouted in crowded halls. They are whispered in acts of patience. They are sealed by shared burdens. They are made quietly, deeply, without words. Love, if it came at all. Love was not expected. Not at first, in the Middle Ages. Marriage was not built on longing glances or whispered sonnets. It was built on survival, on labor, on family ties and village expectations, on how many eggs a hen could lay, or whether the well on your father's land still held water in August. But even so, sometimes, if the seasons were kind and the match was right, love arrived later, softly, quietly, almost unnoticed. A man and woman might marry having barely spoken. He might know that she worked hard, that her mother was fair, that her brothers weren't the kind to stir trouble. She might know that his ox never went lame, that he stood still during sermons, that his boots were always well mended. That was enough. Their hands might meet for the first time not in affection, but while lifting a sack of grain, their first night under the same roof might be full of silence, each of them staring at the low beams above their heads, listening to the fire settle. But then came the days. He learned how she liked her bread dark, with the crust near burnt. She noticed he always fed the dog before he fed himself. They found a rhythm, not romantic, but practical, and in that rhythm, something else might take root. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes, a woman would begin to hum again, while she worked, and her husband would notice. He wouldn't say anything. Just pause for a moment longer before stepping outside. Sometimes, a man would come home later than usual, and find the hearth still lit, and his wife sitting there with an extra bowl set out, though she never asked where he'd been, and sometimes, one of them would fall ill. That's when the feelings showed, a hand lingering too long on a forehead, a sleepless night spent keeping the fire going, a whispered prayer to a saint they barely believed in, because losing each other had become unthinkable. Love didn't always look the way it does now. There were no declarations in the rain, no runaway weddings. There was just time, patience, forgiveness after arguments, familiarity so deep that silence between them became a kind of language. Sometimes they laughed. That's how you knew, when a man teased his wife about how loudly she sang while beating the rugs, or when she rolled her eyes at how often he misplaced the same hat, and then brought it to him anyway. That was love, not the love that lit fires, but the kind that kept them burning. And so, even though marriage had begun as an arrangement, between fields, between families, what grew within its walls was often deeper than anyone expected. Love, if it came at all, arrived late, but when it did, it stayed. Marrying young, marrying well, in the medieval world, childhood didn't last long. There were games, yes, songs, stories, and barefoot races through the village green. But before a child could even finish their first dozen winters, the weight of work had already settled on their shoulders, and soon after came marriage. Most people married young by modern standards, very young. A girl might be betrothed by 12 or 13, married by 14 or 15. A boy, if he had enough land or skill, might wed as soon as he was able to build a roof or sow a field, not because they were ready for romance, but because they were needed. The land didn't pause to wait for maturity. The livestock didn't stop breeding. The thatched roofs still needed patching. The barley still needed sowing. And parents, many of whom had lost children before, didn't count on long futures. They planned while time was still theirs. Better to marry early, some would say, before the world decides otherwise. But youth didn't always mean unprepared. By the time a girl was 14, she'd likely been baking bread for half her life. She'd watched her mother give birth, helped raise her younger siblings, and spun enough wool to fill a dowry chest. A boy, too, knew the tools of his trade. He'd spent years beside his father or uncle, planting, cutting, building. In many ways they were old before they were grown. Still, not everyone married so early. In some towns, especially where trades or church learning were involved, people waited longer. A craftsman's son might train for years before marrying. A girl from a wealthier household might not wed until she was 17, even 20. And then there were those who didn't marry at all. The poor sometimes never had the means. The deeply devout joined monasteries or cloisters. Some women became servants in larger homes and never left. A few, just a few, chose to live alone, though that path was narrow and rarely easy. But for those who did marry young, it wasn't strange, it was expected, it was life. Marry well, their parents might say, not meaning marry for love, but marry for steadiness, for skill, for strength, for survival, because a good match meant more than affection. It meant a roof that didn't leak. It meant lambs that survived the frost. It meant shared silence at the end of a long day, and someone to turn to when the fire burned low. It meant, most of all, a future, not grand, not rich, not carefree, but shared. And so they married young, not in haste, not always in joy, but in quiet hope. And many of them, despite the hardship, despite the youth, endured, not because they were old enough, but because they had no other choice, and somehow they made it enough. The role of the parish priest. He wasn't a nobleman. He didn't ride in on horseback or carry a sword. His robe was plain, his home was modest, and more often than not, his hands were calloused, familiar with farm tools as much as holy texts. But in every village, tucked between the manor and the market field, the parish priest stood as a quiet thread connecting heaven and earth. And when a wedding was near, he always knew before anyone else. The priest was the keeper of the banns. the formal announcement of intent to marry. For 3 Sundays before the wedding, he would rise before the gathered congregation and call out the names of the bride and groom, not in celebration, but as a question. If anyone here knows a reason why these two should not be joined? He paused. Always. Not because he expected protest, though on rare, sharp-edged days there were whispers of it, but because the silence that followed his words was as important as the words themselves. It meant the community consented, or at least chose not to speak. It was the priest's duty to make sure there were no secret marriages, no coerced unions, no forgotten promises made in drunken corners of feast halls. He asked questions, carefully, privately, not just about the dowry or the day, but about readiness. Do you go of your own will? He would ask the bride. Have you made no promises to another? He might ask the groom. Not every priest was kind. Some were strict, others distant, but most were deeply tied to their flock. They baptized the newborn, blessed the harvest, buried the old, and they had seen time and again what became of hasty, uneasy, or bitterly arranged marriages. So when a couple came to be wed, the priest didn't simply say words. He watched. He watched how the boy looked at the girl, not just whether he smiled, but whether he hesitated. He watched how she held her hands, not whether they were clean, but whether they trembled. He knew what questions to ask, and which ones to leave unspoken. And then came the preparation. Some priests insisted on a confession before the ceremony, a cleansing of sorts, not just of sins, but of secrets. Others led the couple in prayer, asking for patience, for strength, for rain when needed, and peace when it could be had. The ceremony itself was simple. In some villages, it took place outside the church, beneath the sky, at the chapel's threshold, where witnesses could gather and hear every word. The priest would lead them through the vows, carefully spoken, binding them before God and the village. This man and this woman, he would say, join not only their hands but their lives. He might bless them with holy water. He might press their joined hands together with a strip of cloth, a symbol older than the faith itself, carried into the Christian rite from long-forgotten customs of tying hearts to seasons, flesh to promise. But most of all, he bore witness. The priest did not make the marriage. The couple did that themselves, with consent, with will, with the steady breath of spoken words. But the priest made it sacred. He reminded everyone watching that this was more than agreement, it was covenant, and it would be remembered. After the ceremony, he often stayed in the background. He ate little at the feast. He walked home alone, sometimes just as the moon began to rise. He had seen dozens of weddings, perhaps hundreds, but each one lingered differently. Some filled him with hope, others with quiet worry, but still he did his part. He recorded the names in his ledger, he noted the date, he prayed for them by name in the still dark of morning, and if trouble ever came, if voices were raised, or children went hungry, or one spouse fell ill, it was often the priest who was called first, because he knew the promises, because he had watched them form, because he had stood close enough to hear the tone in their voices and the spaces between their words. In a world of hard work, short lives and long winters, the parish priest was not simply a figure in robes, he was memory. He was mercy. He was the stillness in the middle of the village that whispered, someone is watching, and someone cares. A wedding day begins at dawn. The day of the wedding began before the sun fully rose. It was not dramatic. There were no bells ringing through the hills or long lines of horses trotting through gates. There were only the small, slow sounds of morning, of kindling catching flame, of chickens shifting in their roosts, of feet slipping into worn shoes by the door. It was dawn. And it was still. The bride's family rose first. In the corner of the house, a pot was already warming over the fire. The mother stirred it without speaking, the spoon circling in the same rhythm she'd used every morning for years. But today, it meant more. Today, it would feed her daughter before she left. The bride herself was likely already awake. Sleep came lightly the night before. Too many thoughts, too many whispered questions. She might have lain in bed, listening to the house creak, the coals settle, the wind pass over the thatch roof. She wasn't nervous, exactly, but she felt the weight of it, of the change. When she finally rose, the house was hushed, but moving. Her younger siblings watched her with big eyes, sensing something was different. She smiled at them, but didn't say much. Her hands were steady as she dressed, not in a gown of silk, but in her best wool, something she'd stitched herself over long evenings by candlelight. Someone, perhaps her mother, perhaps an aunt, braided her hair. They didn't speak either. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been passed between them in glances and gestures over the years. A quiet sigh, a hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a ribbon tied more carefully than usual. Outside, the village was beginning to wake. Neighbors lit their fires. The smith walked out to check the sky. A dog barked once and then fell quiet. There was no music yet, no laughter, but doors began to open. Feet stepped onto frost-kissed paths. The world began to turn again. The groom prepared in his own way. He didn't fuss with clothes, just made sure they were clean. He checked the soles of his shoes, ran a cloth once across the buckle of his belt, sat on a stool near the hearth, staring into the glow, letting the warmth touch his fingers. Maybe his father said something to him, maybe not. Men didn't always speak their blessings aloud, but there might have been a nod, a squeeze on the shoulder, the passing of a cup. Before long someone called out, the kind of call that didn't need repeating. It was time, and so just as the sky turned pale blue and the sun crept over the treetops, the bride stepped outside. She stood for a moment, breathing the cold, damp morning air. Everything looked the same, and yet everything felt different. She walked slowly, not in ceremony, but with care. Villagers joined her path, falling in beside her, not ahead, not behind. The groom walked from his own home. Their paths would meet by the chapel, just as the first full light of day spilled across the ground. No music, no procession, just a gathering, a meeting of breath, of steps, of steady hearts. The wedding day had begun, not with fanfare, but with dawn, not with noise, but with stillness, and not with celebration, but with quiet readiness. The washing of hands and feet, before the chapel, before the vows, before the feast and the firelight and the long walk home as husband and wife. There was water, not for drinking, not for cooking, but for preparing the body in a way the church never officially required, yet many families quietly honored. The washing of hands and feet was not found in every village, but where it lingered, it carried meaning that words couldn't fully hold. It often happened just after dawn in the bride's home, while the air was still cool and the shadows long. Someone, usually a mother or an elder sister, would bring a low basin to the hearth. Inside, clean water, sometimes scented faintly with rosemary or mint, sometimes just warm from the fire. A soft cloth was folded nearby, worn but clean. The bride sat without ceremony. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. There were no prayers spoken aloud, no candles lit for this part. It was simpler than that. First, the feet, bare, pale from winter. The cloth dipped, the water stirred. Each foot was held gently, as one might cradle a child's. The dust of daily life, mud from paths, flour from the mill floor, dried grass from the fields was lifted away. Not scrubbed, just removed, like letting go. Then, the hands, the ones that had spun thread, picked herbs, gathered firewood, and soothed younger siblings during stormy nights. These were not idle hands. They were already the hands of a woman who worked, and yet they were treated like something new. The cloth passed over each finger with care. The water softened calluses. It did not erase them, it honored them. If tears came, they came quietly, not from sadness, from the weight of it, from the realization that this was the last time she'd sit here in this place as someone's daughter first, and everything else second. Sometimes the groom was washed as well, in another house, or later, or even in public, if his family kept the tradition. His father might do it, without speaking, or his mother, hands trembling as she remembered when he was small enough to be bathed in her arms. It wasn't about purity, it was about humility. It was about stepping into the next moment of life, without clinging to the last. In rare cases, both bride and groom washed one another, not in full view of the village, not with spectacle, but in quiet corners, a bowl between them, hands meeting, cloth passed gently from one to the other. It was a promise in motion. I will care for you, I will touch you gently, I will see the labor in your hands and respect it. When the washing was done, the water was never kept. It was poured into the earth behind the cottage, near the roots of the oldest tree, or where the first seeds would be planted after winter. The water had served its moment. Now it returned to the world, as all things eventually do. The bride rose, dried her hands on a cloth she might later fold into her marriage chest. The groom adjusted his belt and wiped his feet on the mat before the door, and with that quietly, cleanly, the day moved forward. Gowns of wool and veils of linen. There were no white dresses, not in the way we think of them now. No silk trailing through cathedrals, no jeweled bodices glinting in the candlelight. Most medieval brides had never even seen silk. let alone worn it. Their wedding gown was made of what they knew: wool, usually, linen, if they were lucky. Always something that had already passed through many hands before the morning of the wedding. A gown might take months to prepare. A mother and daughter might sit together on cold evenings, spinning thread by the hearth, weaving the fabric inch by inch. The wool was dyed, if possible, in whatever color the household could afford: deep brown, soft green, faded blue, rusty red from madder root, earth tones, honest tones. The gown might not be new. In fact, it often wasn't. It might have been worn by an older sister, or saved in a chest for years, in the hope that it would be needed again. But even if it wasn't new, it was cleaned, carefully, stitched where needed, a hem lengthened or shortened, a ribbon replaced. Sometimes, the bride added a piece of embroidery, a small flower at the wrist, a line of thread in a color only she would notice, a detail not meant to show off, but to mark the moment as hers. Beneath the gown, linen, a shift or underdress, pale and plain, its softness earned from years of washing. Linen was treasured. It didn't come easy, and it didn't last forever, but on this day, it was part of the layers that wrapped the bride in comfort and modesty. And then, the veil. Not every bride wore one, but when she did, it was simple: a rectangle of linen or fine wool, pinned carefully over her hair. Sometimes it was sheer enough to see through, other times it was opaque, more like a hood or mantle, worn for warmth as much as tradition. The veil didn't hide her, it framed her. It signaled, not submission, but transition, a way of saying, I have stepped out of girlhood and into something new. If there was a belt, it might have been leather. If there were shoes, they were likely her everyday pair, polished, if possible, with a bit of beeswax rubbed into the seams. She might carry nothing at all, or perhaps a sprig of herbs: rosemary for memory, lavender for peace. Jewelry was rare, maybe a pin, passed down from her grandmother, a brooch carved with a bird or a simple cross. More often, her adornment was the care taken in the dressing itself: the neatly tied laces, the carefully brushed hair, the veil pinned smooth. She looked beautiful, not because she was transformed, but because she was seen by her family, by her village, by the man who waited at the chapel door. He too wore his best, which often meant what was cleanest, least patched, most recently mended. His belt might have a new hole punched in it. His tunic might carry the faintest scent of wood smoke and sheep's wool, but he stood tall, his hands scrubbed, his boots dusted clean. Neither of them dressed to impress. They dressed to honor the day, to honor the life they were about to step into. Gowns of wool, veils of linen, clothes made not by tailors, but by time, by mothers, by moments spent waiting and stitching and hoping. And when they walked toward each other, the sun catching on threads smoothed by countless hands, it was enough. It was more than enough. Blessings, spoken beneath the oaks. Not every wedding ended with a chapel. In some villages, far from stone cathedrals and trained clergy, there were no great bells to ring, no stained glass, no carved pulpits. There were just trees, old ones, older than memory. Trees that had watched over generations, that had seen births, harvests, deaths, and marriages. And among these, none stood more quietly proud than the oaks. Thick-trunked, wide-limbed, their roots coiled deep into the earth, and their shade stretched far enough to gather a family underneath. When a bride and groom walked to the place of their vows, it might have been to the churchyard, but just as often it was to the edge of the woods, a grove known not by name, but by feeling, a place that belonged to no one, but was known by all. There, beneath the oak's wide crown, the people gathered: neighbors, friends, children chasing one another around roots, a grandmother leaning on a stick. The priest, if he had come, stood in simple robes. If not, someone else, a village elder, a godparent, or even a respected uncle, might offer the blessing instead, because in the end, the words mattered less than the witness. The bride stood on one side of the tree, the groom on the other, not hidden, not grand, just there. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, a bird chirped, once, then again, and then the vows began. They were simple: I take you, I promise this. Words passed down from one generation to the next, unchanged but always felt fresh when spoken aloud. Sometimes, hands were joined with a cord of flax or wool. Sometimes, a cloth was draped across their shoulders. Sometimes, the couple simply reached out and held one another, their fingers interlacing without instruction. And when it came time for a blessing, it was spoken softly, not shouted, not drawn from scrolls or books, just given. May your roof keep the rain out. May your fire stay warm. May your children know your voice. May you never run out of bread or kindness. There were no choirs, only the wind. There was no incense, only the scent of moss and bark, and the faint sweetness of crushed clover underfoot. In that quiet space, the couple was not made husband and wife by law or formality, but by the gathered presence of those who knew them, who had watched them grow, who would watch them still, and the oak stood over all of it, ancient, unmoved, patient. Long after the people had gone, it would still be there, holding the memory of the vows, the way trees do, silently, deeply, forever. The binding of hands, the blessing of rings. It didn't always happen the same way. Some weddings had music, others didn't. Some were held inside stone churches, others in the shadow of old trees or beside village wells. But across the scattered towns and hamlets of the medieval world, one thing almost always remained. Two hands, joined. The joining of hands was one of the oldest wedding customs in the world. It predated many of the church's formal rituals. It was older than parchment and law. Even when Latin prayers were spoken and holy water sprinkled, this act, this human gesture, was what made it real. He would reach out first, or sometimes she would. Their fingers would meet, palms pressing together, and in that moment, with the eyes of family and neighbors quietly watching, their bond was made visible. This was more than affection, it was agreement, a declaration, simple and direct. I will walk with you, I will carry with you, I will hold what life hands us, together. Then came the binding. It wasn't required. The church didn't demand it. But for those who followed the older customs, or who simply wanted something to mark the moment, there would be a cord. Not fancy, not gold or jeweled. A strip of cloth, a ribbon, a braided rope of wool or flax, spun by a sister, or a grandmother, or the bride herself. Someone would step forward, often the priest, but sometimes a parent. They would take the cord and wrap it gently around the joined hands. Once, twice, enough to encircle, but not to restrain. Enough to mark that these two people had made a promise. The symbolism was clear. They were bound now, not by force, but by choice. Not imprisoned, but tethered. It was a reminder that marriage was not simply about love or survival. It was about shared direction. If one stumbled, the other felt the pull. If one pulled away too far, the other would be drawn along, or torn behind. The knot was never tight, and it was always undone, after the vows were spoken, after the moment had passed. But for those few minutes, it meant something. And then sometimes came the ring. Rings weren't as common in the early centuries. Not everyone had metal to spare. But by the later Middle Ages, even the humblest couples tried to include one. It might be made of iron, or copper, or bronze. Gold was rare, too rare for most. But whatever the material, the meaning was the same. The ring wasn't given for beauty. It was given for memory. It was a sign small and circular, without beginning or end. The priest might bless it with a simple prayer, or the groom might whisper his own words before slipping it onto her finger, and it was always the same finger. The third of the left hand. Not because of nerves or veins, but because tradition had long claimed a line ran straight from that finger to the heart. Whether true or not, it was believed, and belief in the Middle Ages was stronger than fact. Some women never removed their ring after that day. Others wore it only for feast days or church, storing it carefully in a chest beside other precious things, a comb, a ribbon, a single pressed flower. The ring wasn't about wealth, it was about remembering the moment when hands were joined, when eyes met, when words trembling, simple words promised everything and nothing, all at once. And if there was no ring, no cord, no formal ritual, still the hands told the truth. The hands were enough, because in a world that often offered very little, two people choosing to hold one another, publicly, openly, humbly, was sacred all by itself. The village gathers and watches. A wedding wasn't private, even if the vows were spoken in a low voice, even if the chapel was small, and the feast modest, even if the bride's hands trembled and the groom barely looked up from the ground. It was never just between two people. The village came. They always did, not out of curiosity, or celebration, or even kindness, but because a wedding, in the eyes of the medieval world, belonged to everyone. It began slowly. A few neighbors stepped from their doorways, pulling cloaks around their shoulders. Someone carried a child on their hip, others led goats to the edge of the field first. making sure nothing would stray while they were gone. No one was dressed in finery, just clean tunics, a belt tied with care, a shawl pinned neatly. These small choices were acts of respect. They stood in a rough half-circle, not instructed, just instinctive. The priest stood at the front, the couple between them and the chapel, and the village gathered. They watched. That was their role, not to cheer, not to judge, but to witness. Some crossed their arms and said nothing, others whispered behind their hands about the bride's gown, the groom's age, the small dowry, the way the sky looked that morning. Old women remembered their own weddings. Young girls stood on tiptoe, wondering when it would be their turn. Boys elbowed one another quietly, not yet knowing what this moment truly meant. And the elders, the blacksmith, the reeve, the midwife, watched with the weight of memory behind their eyes. They had seen many weddings. Some had led to long winters and soft laughter. Others had ended in quiet heartbreak. Still they came, because their presence made it real. A wedding was not only about consent between two people, it was about recognition from the world around them. If no one saw it, if no one remembered, then what would hold the promise in place during the hard years? So the village gathered and stood still. When the vows were spoken, someone would murmur. When the hands were bound, a child might gasp. When the ring slid onto the finger, a grandmother might quietly wipe her eye. And when the kiss came, if it came at all, it was brief, soft, a touch of lips or a lowering of heads. But the watching eyes caught it. They stored it, because later, when the first baby cried, or the roof sagged, or the harvest failed, the village would remember. I saw them marry, someone would say. I was there, another would nod. I saw the way he looked at her. I heard the way she said his name. And so the marriage was not just written in the church's ledger, it was written in the minds of those who watched. Not every village was kind, but every village remembered, and their memory was a kind of thread, invisible but strong, tying the couple to the world that would carry them forward. Bread shared, wine sipped. There were no champagne flutes, no towers of silver trays, no first dance beneath chandeliers, but there was bread, and there was wine. Simple, warm, and enough. It was an old tradition, older than most could remember, older even than the church's blessing or the scribe's ink in the parish record. After the vows were spoken, and the hands unbound, and the last murmured prayers faded into the quiet morning, the newly married couple turned to one another, not just with words, but with food. A small table stood nearby, not grand, not heavily decorated, just a wooden board set low, sometimes near the chapel door, sometimes beneath the branches of a tree. On it, a loaf of bread, a cup of wine, perhaps a pinch of salt, if fortune allowed. It was not a feast. Not yet. It was something smaller and older. The groom broke the bread, with care. Never rushed. He didn't tear off great hunks, but pulled gently, as though the loaf itself might feel it. The bread was rarely white, most often a dense, hearty brown baked that morning by a mother or aunt. Warm from the village oven, he held it out to the bride, and she took it, with both hands. No one clapped. No one called out. But there was a stillness then, a shared silence, the kind that falls over a field just before the first frost, or around a hearth when the fire catches just right. It wasn't just bread, it was sustenance, a sign, we will feed each other. We will not let each other go hungry. She tore her piece and gave the rest back, and then he ate. Next, the wine. It wasn't poured into 2 cups, but one. A single vessel, small enough to hold with one hand, wide enough for 2 to share. The wine itself was usually red, though sometimes spiced, sometimes sweetened with honey depending on the season and the means. He drank first, just a sip, not a gulp, then offered the cup to her. Their lips didn't need to meet the same spot, but often they did. It was a quiet kind of intimacy, watched by everyone but owned by no one else. Bread and wine, grain and vine, hunger and comfort, work and reward. It was the first act of hospitality between them, and it carried meaning that would ripple through the rest of their days. Because marriage, after all, was not built on declarations, not on ceremony. It was built on feeding someone, day after day, sharing what you had, pouring the last of the wine, even when your own throat was dry. Sometimes, the salt came next, just a pinch, just enough. Salt preserved. It kept food from spoiling. It healed wounds. It was rare, yes, but also necessary, a symbolic taste of what marriage required: preservation, endurance, the will to keep what was good from turning bitter. Some couples touched the salt to their tongues, Some dipped the bread in it, some simply let it sit on the board, as a quiet wish, and when it was done, they stepped back. Not as two people anymore, but as one household, not in the eyes of law, not just yet, that would be signed and sealed in other ways, but in the eyes of those who mattered most, the watchers, the whisperers, the ones who remembered things. This moment held weight. They had fed one another, and that meant something. Later there would be more food, simple stews, hard cheese, apples from storage. There would be laughter, music, games. But this moment, the bread and the wine, this was the first kindness, the first keeping, the first promise kept. A song played on the rebec. There was food on the table now, not a feast in the grand sense. No silver trays, no whole roasted boars, but enough. Stewed beans, barley bread, maybe a joint of meat shared among many. Some brought their own cheese, others traded for fruit or sweet cakes if they could. It was loud in that way villages become when everyone is full and speaking at once, children running beneath benches, elders reminiscing, someone laughing too hard at something not especially funny. But just as the chatter reached its peak, someone stood, not the priest, not the lord of the manor, just a young man barely more than a boy, with a leather case slung over his back and nervous fingers, already searching for the shape of what came next. He took out the rebec. It wasn't a beautiful instrument, not in the polished, courtly sense. The wood was scuffed, the strings mismatched, the bow tied at one end with a strip of faded cloth, but everyone knew what it was, and more importantly, everyone knew what it meant. Quiet began to fall, slowly, unevenly, like mist settling across a field. A few children stopped chasing each other, heads turned. The bride lowered her eyes and folded her hands in her lap. The groom leaned back just slightly, the corners of his mouth not quite a smile. The rebec was shaped like a teardrop, small enough to rest on the shoulder or chest, held not with grandeur, but with care. The player drew the bow across the strings, once just to settle the instrument, to find its voice. Then again, the sound it made was thin, high, a little wavering, not powerful, like a pipe organ, not bright, like a lute. The rebec sounded more like wind in a shutter or a distant bird, but that was part of its magic. It could fill a room not by volume but by pulling everyone inward, like a whisper you had to lean in to hear. The melody was simple, not a song of war or glory or saints, not something meant for courts or tapestries, just a tune passed down from someone's uncle, or overheard at another wedding, or made up on the spot with trembling fingers and a hope that it wouldn't fall apart halfway through. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Somewhere in the back, someone hummed along. A few of the older women nodded slowly, their hands still on their cups. One man closed his eyes, letting the notes pass through him like smoke. The rebec didn't ask for attention, it asked for stillness. For a few moments, no one spoke. The couple listened. It wasn't a song about love, not directly. It was about home, about seasons, about walking the same path every day, about seeing the same eyes across a table every night, and choosing again and again not to turn away. It was about the weight of a hand resting on your back as you stirred a pot. It was about a voice, cracked with age, telling a story you've already heard. It was about the silence after an argument, and the quiet return to one another. The song ended without flourish. The last note hovered, then vanished, as if the air had simply swallowed it whole. No one clapped, they didn't need to. The player nodded once, shyly, and stepped back. The rebec was returned to its case, which would stay unopened for another season, maybe longer. The conversation resumed, but softer now. There was something gentler in the air, like dust settling after sunbeams have passed through it, and the bride and groom, they didn't speak either, but their hands found each other under the table, quietly, as if reminded of something they hadn't known they'd forgotten. Because music, even imperfect music, can do that. Dancing on the green. The feast had quieted. The stews were scraped from bowls, the loaves torn down to crumbs, the wine jugs lighter than before. Laughter still lingered in the corners of the yard, but it had grown loose around the edges, softened by full bellies and the slow slide of the sun. And then someone no one ever quite remembered who stood up and said, simply, "Shall we dance?" Not a command, not a performance, just an invitation. There was no polished floor, no formal announcement. Only the green, the patch of grass between the chapel and the fields, trampled by sheep in the mornings, played on by children in the afternoons, and now cleared, just enough for something to begin. Someone brought out a drum. It wasn't much, a round wooden frame stretched with skin, beaten more for rhythm than melody. but its pulse echoed like footsteps down a long dirt path. Someone else clapped their hands, and a third, perhaps the same boy with the rebec from before, plucked a quick, sharp tune on a stringed instrument that might have only had 3 working notes left in it. And that was enough. The younger ones ran forward first, barefoot and laughing, skirts hitched up, sleeves rolled back. They danced not to show skill, but because their legs were restless and the sky was still too light for sleep. Then came the others. Older boys in rough linen shirts, girls with ribbons falling out of their hair, a grandmother with a crooked knee who still knew the steps from 40 years past, a baker who danced with his elbows, and a thatcher who never missed a beat. The bride didn't hesitate. She stepped into the green as though she'd been waiting all day for this. The groom followed her lead. Their movements weren't rehearsed. They didn't glide. They didn't spin like in stories of royal courts. But they smiled. They turned. They clapped in rhythm, and missed a few steps, and laughed when they did. They were part of something, no longer watched, no longer separate, just there. Dancing. The dances themselves were old, circles that turned in on themselves and opened again. Lines that crisscrossed, hands that lifted and released, patterns passed down not through books, but through feet and memory. Some danced for love, others for luck, others just because they were still standing and the day had been kind. Children darted between the adults. Chickens wandered too close and were gently shooed. Someone tripped over a root, and everyone laughed. The air smelled like trampled grass and cider and sweat. The moon began to rise. No one called it the first dance, but it was. It was the first moment the bride and groom moved as one in front of everyone they knew, not in stillness, not in silence, but in rhythm, in breath, in shared momentum. A step forward, a step back, a turn, a hand caught in another. They danced not because they had to. They danced because this was what came after bread and vows. Because joy doesn't always need planning. Eventually, the music slowed. The drum beats softened. The stringed notes thinned into evening air. People drifted back to their places, to benches, to fences, to blankets on the ground. The bride rested her head on her husband's shoulder, the green quiet again beneath them. And above, the stars waited patiently for everyone to stop looking at one another and look up. But for now, the green still held warmth. It held footprints. It held the memory of 100 steps taken together, and it would hold them all night, even after the last voice fell quiet. The bride's shoes and the groom's belt. By the time the dancing faded and the last light slipped behind the trees, there were only a few things left to notice. The bread had been shared, the hands had been joined, the village had watched, and the songs had drifted out into the hills. But if you looked closely, if you stepped back from the noise and the cheer and instead looked down, you'd see what remained. The bride's shoes and the groom's belt, they weren't much to speak of, not compared to what nobility wore. Not embroidered, not gilded, not even new, but they mattered. The bride's shoes were soft with wear, not slippers, but serviceable leather, scuffed at the toes, dyed with a weak solution of walnut or ash. Her mother had stitched them tighter the night before, reinforcing the seams that had split last winter. She had worn them to the mill, to the chapel, once even to a funeral, but never like this. Before stepping into them that morning, the bride had washed her feet. Her sister laid a sprig of dried rosemary inside each sole, not for smell, for memory, for steadiness, because there was an old belief that rosemary guided women through threshold moments, birth, marriage, death, and brought their feet back home again. She walked carefully that day, not just to keep them clean, but because she knew the path mattered. She was walking into something new. The shoes held every step she took, every pause, every small shift of weight, and when she danced, they creaked. When she stood still for the blessing, they held her firmly. And later, when the day was nearly done, they would be the last thing she slipped off before she laid down to sleep. They were hers, and now they would carry a different kind of dust. The groom's belt was plain, worn tight around his tunic, pulled snug but not boastful. Leather, darkened by years, with a buckle made of iron or brass, depending on what his family had been able to trade long ago. There was a nick near the end, where his younger brother had once borrowed it and tied it too tight. Some men received their belts at confirmation, others made them themselves. This one, the groom had worn for years. It had held a knife, a pouch, sometimes even a hammer, but today it held nothing but his posture. Before the ceremony, he had rubbed it with beeswax, quietly, in the corner of the room. No one had asked him to, it was just something he felt he ought to do. There were small charms tied to the inside of the buckle, most people didn't notice. A loop of thread, a coin rubbed nearly smooth, a twist of cloth from his mother's apron. These weren't talismans, exactly, just pieces of memory. Bits of life, bound there to remind him of who he'd been before this day. After the vows were spoken, and the bread broken, and the music played, the bride and groom stood beside one another in the twilight. Her shoes dusted, his belt slightly loosened, no crowns, no robes, just those two things, holding them up, carrying them forward, and for those who noticed, they were enough, because sometimes, in the soft quiet after joy, it's the little things we wear that tell the truth about who we are, and what we're stepping into next. Coins tossed to children. The wedding was almost over. The sun had slid low, casting long shadows across the fields. The bread had been eaten. The last cup of wine drained. The music now only hummed in the memory of those who had danced. But there was still one thing left, one custom kept for last, a moment held for the youngest among them. Coins, not many, not heavy, but enough. Someone, an uncle, the groom's father, the bride's godmother, stepped forward with a small cloth pouch, not velvet, not gilded, just simple homespun tied with string. It jingled faintly when shaken. That sound alone was enough to send the nearby children into sudden stillness. They had been waiting, not for the vows, not for the songs, but for this. A child can sit through sermons and feasts and blessings if they know what's coming at the end. The pouch was handed to the groom, or sometimes the bride, or sometimes both, and then, just as the dusk settled, a hand reached into the bag and flung a small shower of coins into the air. Not far, just enough. The metal flashed once in the falling light, a gleam of copper, a rare glint of silver, and then they hit the earth, soft, dull thuds against grass and dust. Children burst forward, feet slapped the dirt, hands scraped the ground, shouts rose like sparrows. Some laughed, others scrambled in silence, their faces pinched with determination. Even the smallest among them toddled out, fists clenched tight around a single coin they might not let go of for days. It wasn't about the money. A single coin might buy a scrap of ribbon, or a honey cake. It might be slipped into a pocket and forgotten. But it wasn't about that. It was about tradition, about memory, about the way moments linger. Older villagers watched with half smiles, remembering when they had run like that, mud on their knees, eyes on a coin still spinning in the dust. Parents lifted toddlers up high to reach just one. A few of the elders murmured old sayings. Catch a wedding coin, and luck will follow your feet. 3 coins before sundown, and you'll wed by spring. But mostly no one spoke. They just watched. The bride and groom stood nearby, their hands still smudged from the day. He laughed when a boy nearly fell into a basket of apples. She bent down once to help a small girl who had missed every coin, pressed something gently into her palm. And when the pouch was nearly empty, they gave the last few coins not by throwing them, but by placing them. One to the smith's orphan son, one to the shy child with the crooked smile, one to the girl who had stood so still during the vows, her hands clasped like a prayer. Each coin, a seed, scattered not into soil, but into lives. The sun dipped lower, the last squeals faded. Coins were tucked into shoes, into aprons, into secret boxes carved from scrap wood, and the wedding, now truly ending, folded itself into memory, not with ceremony, not with a final word, but with the sound of children running, and the jingle of copper in small hands. The feast after the vows. Once the vows were spoken, and the hands unbound, once the bride's veil had been gently adjusted by a sister, or the groom's belt straightened by a friend, and once the children had scattered with coins in their fists, and the music began to hush into memory, then came the feast. Not the lavish kind you might find in the courts of kings. There were no roasted swans here, no sugar sculptures, no golden platters carried by silent servants. This was a village table. It began as planks laid across barrels, or boards dragged into the yard, balanced on rocks and old stools, a blanket thrown here, a bench pulled from a neighbor's home there. There was no seating chart, just people sitting where the light hit softest. And when the food arrived, it came all at once. Bowls of pottage, thick with barley and cabbage, and sometimes a bit of pork, if someone had been saving a joint for the occasion. Dark rye loaves, round and crusty, warm from the oven just hours before, split with knives passed from hand to hand. Cheese, rough cut, sharp and slightly crumbly. apples from last autumn's storehouse, sliced and sprinkled with salt, turnips roasted in the coals, steaming when broken open. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough. Each household brought what it could, some more, some less, a jug of ale, a jar of pickled eggs, dried beans boiled soft and seasoned with onions. It was a feast in the way that mattered, every dish touched by care, every bite passed with intention. The bride and groom sat in the middle, not raised above, not apart, but within. Their plates looked like everyone else's, their spoons were borrowed, their cups likely mismatched, but they were seen. Every smile sent their way was a quiet toast. Every bowl offered first to them was a blessing unspoken. Conversation flowed like the ale, old stories told again, as if they were new. The time the groom fell into the well as a boy, the moment the bride stood up to a travelling merchant over the price of wool, laughter rose and fell, gently. No need to shout, the night would carry every voice evenly. There were toasts, not formal, not rehearsed, just someone raising a mug and saying what was true. To the bride who never forgets anyone's name, to the groom who still owes me a chicken, to both of them, who now must figure out who gets the side of the bed closest to the fire. The children were given their own corner, smaller bowls, messier faces, bigger grins, and once their bellies were full, they wandered back into the dusk, chasing stories and ghosts among the hedgerows, while the adults lingered. Sometimes a singer stood up, a slow ballad, maybe, a love story that ended in joy, or tragedy, but sung so gently that both endings felt the same, or perhaps just a verse repeated from memory, the kind you hum through because you've forgotten half the words. The feast went on until the candles began to flicker, and still no one hurried. Some people leaned back on elbows, others rested heads on each other's shoulders. It wasn't about finishing, it was about staying, about letting the moment stretch a little longer than it needed to, because everyone knew that after tonight, life would resume, animals would need feeding, the fields would call, rain would come, or it wouldn't, arguments would return, illness maybe, or just the slow erosion of joy into quiet contentment. But tonight, just tonight, was feast, one meal to mark a beginning, and the bride and groom, full and tired and warmed by the fire, would look around at their people and know, without needing to say it, they were part of something, fed, seen, held, and for now that was enough. Ali, roasted onions, and cheese. As the night stretched gently forward, and the last light of day curled itself behind the trees, the heart of the feast wasn't the abundance. It was the small, familiar comforts, the foods people didn't think twice about in daily life, but that tonight took on a kind of quiet holiness. Ali, roasted onions, cheese. They weren't the centerpieces. They weren't saved for lords or displayed in grand dishes, but they were always there, always enough. And tonight they tasted better than anyone could remember. The ale came first, and it wasn't the clear, golden liquid you might imagine today. Medieval ale was cloudy, full-bodied, and alive. Brewed by women in kitchens with smoky rafters and stone hearths, it had no hops, just grains, water, and the magic of thyme and yeast. It didn't last long, it wasn't meant to. Ali was brewed to be consumed within days, and weddings were the perfect excuse. The best batches were set aside for just such occasions. Thick, earthy, gently bitter, it was poured into wooden mugs or clay cups, passed from hand to hand. It wasn't sipped delicately, it was drunk in good company, with the clink of cups and soft laughter under the stars. Even the children in some homes were given small tastes, watered down of course, enough to mark the moment. And with the ale came the roasted onions. They'd been slow cooked in the coals for most of the afternoon, wrapped in leaves or laid directly on the embers, their skins blackened and curled, while inside they softened to something sweet and golden. A dish like that needed no ceremony. They were split open with a thumb, scooped with bread, passed around without plates. Their scent mingled with the scent of earth and wool and wood smoke. It was the kind of food that made people hum to themselves as they ate, forgetting they were even doing it. And there was cheese, not uniform, not pressed into perfect wheels. Every cottage had its own shape, its own tang. Some were fresh and soft, still wrapped in cloth and dusted with ash. Others had aged for weeks in cool corners of stone cellars, sharp and firm and crumbling. They didn't arrive on silver trays. They were unwrapped from cloths, cut with the same knives used to carve apples or split bread. No one praised them aloud, but people reached for seconds. That was praise enough. The cheese was shared between neighbors, sometimes traded across the table. Try this, ours turned out strong this year. That one's from their goats, they feed them mint. None of it was rich, but all of it was generous. Because what mattered wasn't rarity, it was recognition. Every flavor tasted of someone's care. The ale of a woman's stirring hand and her guess at just the right fermenting time. The onions of a man turning them carefully in the fire, so they wouldn't burn. The cheese of long mornings spent separating curds from whey, pressing them under stones while children tugged at sleeves. Together they formed the true taste of the wedding, not extravagant, not memorable to outsiders, but to those seated around that flickering firelight, unforgettable. Later, when the couple recalled their wedding, they might forget the words of the priest, they might forget who spilled wine, or which child fell asleep in the reeds, but they would remember the first sip of ale together, the sweetness of the onion she handed him, the bite of the cheese they both reached for at once, and laughed. And so, long after the songs were sung, and the guests had wandered home, those small foods lingered. Because the best parts of a wedding are rarely loud, they are roasted slowly, fermented quietly, shared without ceremony, and savored with the kind of hunger that has little to do with food. Stories by firelight. The feast had begun to fade, plates were emptied, the last of the bread had been passed around, torn with fingers now sticky from cheese and ash. Some of the children had curled up beneath cloaks, their eyes half-lidded, lulled by food and the slow rhythm of laughter. Only the fire remained bright. It sat at the center of it all, a low ring of stone, flickering with orange light. Not the main hearth inside the hall, but the one outside, built for gatherings like this. A fire not for cooking, but for staying. People shifted closer, one by one, wrapping their cloaks tighter, pressing their feet nearer to the warmth. The light cast long shadows on faces, softened wrinkles, turned old scars into gentle lines, and as it always did, the silence between songs became a space for something older. Stories, no one said, "Tell us one." No one had to, it was understood. There was always someone who began, a shepherd with a voice rough from wind, a grandmother who stirred the embers with a stick while she spoke, a cousin from the next village over, who only came to weddings and funerals, and always had something strange to say. The first story might have been a love tale, a knight and a miller's daughter, or a maiden cursed to forget her husband's face every night. Something with a little magic, a little sadness, and just enough hope to make people lean forward. Then another voice joined in. This one told a story about the groom as a boy, how he once tried to fight off a wild pig with a broom handle, and lost a shoe for his trouble. The bride laughed into her hands, her cheeks turned red, not from embarrassment, but from remembering. A third voice, an older man, quiet for most of the evening, now telling of a wedding he saw during the famine years. No feast, no fire, just two people, standing barefoot in a frost-covered field, with their hands joined and their eyes shut tight. A story told without pity, just presence. The fire popped, sparks lifted, danced, then vanished into the cool night. Someone added a log, the light shifted, shadows leaned back in again. Then came the stories that didn't end neatly. A woodsman who vanished into the forest and returned 30 years later. A wedding ring passed down through 5 generations until it ended up buried in the roots of an apple tree. A vow made at a village well that no one dared break, even after the couple had passed. These were not bedtime stories. They weren't meant to teach or comfort. They were offered like bread at a table, freely, without certainty, without polish. Some had holes in them. Some changed depending on who told them. That didn't matter. What mattered was the sharing. Because in a world where time was counted in harvests and storms, stories made it possible to stretch moments just a little longer, to explain what could not be named, to connect the newly married to the long married, and even to the never married, those who carried love in other ways, and watched it from a quiet distance. The bride listened with her head on the groom's shoulder. The groom listened with one hand wrapped around hers, and both of them, full from the meal, and slow with contentment, felt the words settle inside them like warm stones. Not instructions, not lessons, but echoes, echoes of what it meant to bind your life to another's, to say yes to days of hunger and song, of arguments and soft forgiveness, of soil on the boots and stories by firelight. The night grew colder, voices dimmed, but the stories half told, half remembered, remained, waiting to be picked up again at the next wedding, or whispered someday by someone else, in another firelit circle, remembering this night. The quiet of the wedding chamber. At last, the fire had burned low, the bowls had been stacked, the last of the ale drained from the jugs. The village no longer sang or danced. Feet were sore, voices hoarse. The fields lay waiting for tomorrow. Even the stars had fallen into place above the rooftops, like they had always been there, watching. And now, there was only this. The room. Small, stone, or timber, depending on where you were born. A single room tucked above the main hall, or behind a thick curtain drawn across a quiet corner. It wasn't decorated with rose petals or lace. It held no perfumes. There were no petals on the floor, no silks on the bed, but it was clean. Someone had swept earlier in the day. A mat had been laid fresh with rushes. The air still held a trace of bread from the earlier baking, and the faint perfume of thyme rubbed into the doorway. The bride stepped in first. She didn't speak. There wasn't much to say. Her hands, still carrying the feel of bread crust and cool cups, reached down to untie her laces. Slowly, not hurried, just quiet. The kind of quiet that filled all the spaces left behind when a long day was over. The groom followed behind. He closed the door gently so the latch would not rattle. His fingers found the belt he had worn since morning, the one that had felt snug with nerves. He set it down beside the bed with care. There were no servants here, no procession, no witnesses, only stillness. The bed was small, straw-filled. A wooden frame, sometimes shared with blankets passed down through generations. A low candle flickered on a shelf nearby, casting shapes that looked briefly like moving people before settling into stillness again. The room wasn't sacred, but it felt like it could be. She looked at him, not as a bride, not in that ceremonial way, but as someone who had stood beside him all day, who had spoken vows, shared food, held his hand when no one was watching. He looked back in the same way, and they moved slowly. Because even when you've known someone your whole life, something shifts here, in the hush, in the soft pause before sleep, in the knowledge that tomorrow begins differently. There might have been nervousness. Of course, there might have been silence, or giggles, or whispered questions, but there was also gentleness, not the kind you find in stories, grand and sweeping, but the smaller kind, the steadier kind. A blanket pulled up to the shoulders, a hand resting lightly on a forearm, a shared breath. Outside the window, the wind brushed the shutters. Somewhere in the fields, a dog barked once, then quieted, and inside the wedding chamber, there was no rush, no need to be anything more than present. The candle light flickered once and dimmed. The straw creaked under shifting weight, and in that simple room, two people who had spoken vows earlier now spoke no words at all, just silence, just breath, just the long, slow settling of hearts into new rhythm. This was the end of the wedding, but the beginning of something far quieter, and maybe far more lasting. Sheets, witnesses, and the next day. Morning came slowly, not with fanfare, not with trumpets, just with birdsong slipping through cracks in shutters, and the soft creak of floorboards as someone passed by carrying kindling. Smoke curled from early hearths, water boiled in iron pots. Another day had begun, but not quite like the others, because this morning, two people woke side by side. The room, now quiet and dim, held the faint scent of straw and last night's candle wax. The blanket had shifted in sleep. One shoe had been left at the edge of the bed. A cloak, half folded, sat on the bench as if no one had decided where it belonged yet. And on the bed, the sheets. They weren't embroidered, not perfumed, just linen, washed and laid flat the day before, but they carried meaning now. In many places, in many villages, the sheets mattered, not for sentiment, but for proof. Marriage, after all, wasn't just about love. It was about law, about inheritance, about the joining of two families, two farms, two futures. And so the custom stood, unspoken in some homes, quietly expected in others, that there should be witnesses. Sometimes it was a mother, a midwife, a village elder, trusted with discretion. They did not intrude, but they might knock, or be summoned, or find a way to enter, eyes down, to lift a corner of the sheet and nod, not to judge, not to gossip, but to confirm, to record in memory that what had begun in ceremony had been completed in quiet, that the union was whole, that the vows had reached beyond words, and then it was done. The sheet folded, the word passed quietly, no announcement needed, just the subtle shift in how neighbors looked at the couple that morning, a little warmer, a little more knowing. The bride washed her face at the basin, her sleeves rolled up past the elbow. She combed her hair slowly, carefully, as though feeling it for the first time. Her eyes lingered on the light, through the wooden slats. The groom stepped outside first. He was handed a warm crust of bread, by someone who did not speak, only smiled. A friend clapped him gently on the shoulder, not too hard, not as a joke, just enough to say, "You did well." He nodded, but said little. The village didn't stop for them. Chores resumed. Goats needed walking, milk needed skimming. The world, faithful and unmoved, continued turning. But within that quiet, there was recognition. A husband, a wife, no longer bride and groom, something more solid now. The families exchanged words over shared breakfast, fewer jokes, more warmth. Someone began preparing for the week ahead. A child asked when there would be another wedding. Laughter followed, but it didn't linger. There would be many days after this one, but this day, in its slow, wordless unfolding, carried a kind of weight, not dramatic, not grand, just quiet, like a sheet folded and placed away, like a witness who says nothing, but remembers, like two people, walking back into the world, together. Gifts from the groom's kin. By the morning after the wedding, the village had begun to turn back toward its rhythms. The animals had not waited. The bread still needed baking. Children still ran in the yard, chasing chickens that would never be caught. But in one corner of the home, often the same room where the bride and groom had first slept side by side, there came a moment set apart. It came quietly, no announcement, no parade. A knock on the post, a clearing of the throat, and then, one by one, the groom's kin stepped forward. Not with jewels, not with gold. Those were for other stories. These were gifts of another kind. The mother of the groom came first, carrying a bundle wrapped in plain cloth. Inside, wool spun from the flock she had kept through 3 winters. Grey-brown, soft, sturdy, enough to make a warm underdress, or maybe a shawl. "I spun this," she said simply, "for your winters, for your children." She didn't stay long. She placed it near the hearth and left without waiting for thanks. Then came an aunt, her hands rough from dyeing fabric in bark and ash. She brought a square of cloth, stained a soft yellow from marigold petals, the corners stitched with crooked daisies. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean, and it was hers. "This is for your table," she said, "or for your lap when the soup is hot." She smiled once. That was enough. A cousin brought a wooden spoon, not new, but oiled, well cared for. The bowl of it had worn smooth from use. "This stirred our pots for years," he said. "Now it's yours." The gifts continued. A carved hairpin, a small pot of salve made from comfrey and lard, a pair of warm socks, knitted in the evenings by a sister who didn't speak much, a sprig of dried lavender, a tiny bell once tied around a lamb's neck for luck. Each gift was ordinary, but none were forgettable, because they were not offerings of wealth. They were offerings of inclusion, of welcome, of silent messages that said, "You are ours now, not just his. Ours." The bride accepted them without ceremony. She said thank you where she could. She touched each item with care. She listened to the small explanations offered, the stories behind the wool, the meaning of the carvings, the reasons why this oil and not that one. And when the room was quiet again, and the sun had lifted higher into the morning sky, she gathered the gifts and set them gently on a shelf by the window, not to show them off, not to keep them out of reach, but to remind herself, each day in this new home, that she had not arrived empty-handed, and she had not arrived alone. These gifts were more than tools. They were threads, binding her to her husband's kin, to their daily life, to the long story that had started before her, and now included her. A story told not in words, but in wool and cloth, and spoons worn smooth by years of stirring. What the neighbors remember. By the time a week had passed, the wedding was already slipping into memory. The ale had long been drunk. The rushes on the floor were swept out, flattened, and replaced. The borrowed spoons returned. The spilled candle wax scraped away with a thumb. The bride and groom were now simply man and wife. They had begun the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Shared mornings, shared work, the slow building of a household. But across the village, tucked into other cottages, scattered around hearths and ploughshares, the neighbors still remembered. Not the way a chronicler remembers, with names and dates and neat script, but the way ordinary people remember things in fragments, in feelings, in phrases repeated, in idle conversation. In silences too. One old woman remembered the shoes the bride had worn, not because they were new, but because they were worn with grace. She remembered how the girl had walked slowly, even when the path was muddy, and how she had paused to help a child step over a puddle near the chapel door. A boy remembered the coins. He had caught two, one with each hand. He had hidden them beneath his sleeping mat, certain they would bring luck, or at least a chance at something sweet from the next traveling merchant. He didn't remember the vows, but he remembered that moment, the gleam in the air and the clatter in the dust. The baker remembered the groom's father, raising a mug, and saying only 3 words. He chose well. It had been quiet, almost missed. But the baker, who listened more than he spoke, remembered the way those words had landed, like a stone placed in just the right spot in a wall. A neighbor with a stiff knee remembered the laughter at the feast, not what was said, just the sound of it, round and rolling, like bread dough being slapped on a board. She hadn't laughed like that in months. She remembered leaning back on the bench and thinking, it's good sometimes to just be warm and full, and among people. And the smith's apprentice remembered the bride's voice. She hadn't spoken much, but once, when someone dropped a plate, she'd bent to pick it up and said gently, it's only clay, and we're only people. He didn't understand exactly what she meant, but it stayed with him. It still did. Not all memories were tender. Someone remembered the cousin who drank too much and sang too loudly. Someone else remembered the 2 guests who argued in hushed tones behind the granary. But even those moments faded faster than the rest. What lingered was the feeling that for one day the whole village had paused. The worries about harvest, about blight, about broken thatching or missing hens, all of it had been set aside, and in its place there had been bread, and music, and the sight of 2 people looking at each other like they were trying to remember the shape of the moment for the rest of their lives. That's what the neighbors remembered. Not perfection, not spectacle, but closeness, a fire that reached out into the dark and warmed more than just the married pair. And long after the day itself had passed, and the cloaks were hung, and the boots scraped clean, those who had been there could still say, if asked quietly, it was a good wedding, a kind one, the sort you don't forget, even if they already had. When marriage was survival, not every marriage began with joy, not every bride entered the chamber with hope, not every groom held his new wife's hand with tenderness, and not every wedding was for love. Sometimes it was for land, or labor, or the chance to tie 2 debts together, so that neither family fell through the cracks in a hungry winter. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not always a choice. It was a necessity, a framework, a patch sewn onto the worn fabric of village life to keep the cold out just a little longer. Because alone, most people could not survive. A man alone could plow a field, but he couldn't cook, tend to children, thatch the roof, weave the cloth, clean the cuts, patch the shoes, boil the herbs, not all at once, not year after year. And a woman alone might keep the fire lit, but without help to bring in wheat, or chop wood, or bargain for salt, the fire would not burn forever. So 2 people joined, not just for affection, but for stability, for function, for the promise that when illness came, someone would stay, that when the harvest failed, someone would share, that when a child cried, there would be arms enough to hold them, and when a neighbor came knocking, there would be more than one voice to answer. Many weddings were arranged, some between young people who barely knew each other, others between cousins, or neighbors, or between a widow and a man 20 years older, whose wife had died in childbirth 2 summers ago. It didn't always feel fair. It wasn't always kind, but it was life, and within those unions, something often grew, not always love, but a kind of partnership, a wordless understanding, a rhythm built not on poetry, but on seasons. A glance across the yard that meant I've fed the chickens or you've worked too long today. A shared silence while mending clothes or slicing roots. A closeness born from shared burdens, not shared dreams. Some couples did fall in love, slowly, awkwardly, honestly. Not the love of songs and courtly ballads, but the quieter kind that appeared between blisters and bowls of soup. A love tested not by grand quests, but by sour milk and missing goats and long winters. Other couples never quite found it. They lived, they worked, they did what they must. And still, that too was something strong, because survival in that world meant compromise, endurance. It meant finding shelter in another person's presence, even when warmth did not always follow. And still, weddings were celebrated, because even if it began without joy, there was hope. Hope that something might soften over time. Hope that the pair would come to rely on each other, even if they never whispered sweet words. Hope that children would be healthy, the roof would hold, and each spring would come again. So while stories may lift up the rare bride with stars in her eyes and the groom with a poet's heart, most weddings were quieter, more practical, less dreamy, but no less real, because in the end, the vows weren't just about love, they were about making it through. The widow, the second bride, she did not wear white. There were no garlands in her hair, no new slippers, no lace borrowed from a cousin, or saved from a grandmother's chest. The woman who stood quietly near the chapel door had done this before, years ago, in another season, with another man. In another time, the village knew her. They remembered when her first husband died. Fever, quick and unforgiving. They remembered the stillness of her home afterward. The empty chair by the hearth. The way her hands moved differently for a while. Slower, as though part of her had gone with him. But the years passed, as they always do. The fields needed tending. Her children, if she had any, had grown. Her hair grayed softly at the temples, and though her heart had not forgotten, her hands were still strong. Her table still set for more than one. Her life still long. And so, one spring, a question came. It came not as a proposal with fanfare, but as a conversation near the well, a widower, kind, tired, with a crooked smile, asking if she might share his home, not for passion, not even for companionship, at first, but for balance, for care, for the way two people, worn by life, could steady each other. She said yes, not quickly, not with giddy joy, but with a quiet certainty that surprised even her. So now she stood, not in a gown, but in her everyday dress, the one she wore on feast days, washed, pressed, smelling faintly of lavender and lye. There was no procession, no flower-strewn path, but the people came, not out of excitement, out of respect. They knew the shape of her grief. They had seen her fetch water in winter, mend clothes by firelight, carry on without asking much from anyone. They knew her strength, and they saw too the small, unfamiliar curve of peace on her face that morning. She stood beside her second husband, a man older than she, with hands calloused from tools. He glanced at her, not with hunger or nerves, but with gratitude. The priest spoke simply. The vows were said clearly, and when they were done, the two of them walked home together, slowly, with no rush, a pace set by experience. At the meal that followed, there were no jests about youth, no dancing, just good bread, stew from a borrowed pot, and a single jug of wine passed between neighbors. Someone offered her a blessing, not for romance, but for rest. Someone else gave her a small jar of balm for her hands. The village children didn't quite understand, but they watched her closely anyway. Some whispered, "She's a bride again." Others just said, "She looks different." She did, not younger, not lighter, but whole. Because in a world where life was often short and unpredictable, to marry once was expected, to marry twice was brave. And so the widow, now wife once more, sat at the edge of the fire that night, her second husband beside her, and let herself feel something she hadn't in a long time. Not giddiness, not butterflies, but steadiness, quiet welcome, a place to rest her hands, her voice, her grief, a second beginning, not in spite of sorrow, but shaped by it. Church law and common practice. If you were to ask a bishop in the 12th century what made a marriage true, he would give you an answer full of formality, consent, public vows, witnesses, sometimes even a priest's blessing, though in early centuries that wasn't yet required. There were rules, clear ones, at least on parchment. Marriages should not happen in secret. They should not occur within forbidden degrees of kinship. They should be based on mutual agreement, freely given, and once sealed, they could not be undone. But if you walked a few miles beyond the cathedral, into the villages, across muddy roads and wheat stubble, into homes that rarely saw a clergyman, unless someone was dying, you'd find something else. A different rhythm, a different rulebook, one built from necessity and long memory, not parchment and seal, because church law was one thing, common practice was another. People didn't always marry with priests, they married by troth, by promise. Two people stood before their kin, joined hands, and said the words that mattered, "I will take you." Sometimes it was done outside, sometimes in front of a hearth, sometimes even on a walk, if the moment called for it. If others saw it, and remembered it, it was binding, that was enough. Later, the church would push harder to be involved, to move weddings into the nave, before altars and holy relics, to make them visible, documented, controlled, but tradition was slow to change. In many towns, a wedding still began not with a procession to the church, but with a conversation between families, a hand extended over bread and ale, a quiet agreement, a few neighbors brought in to witness, and then they were husband and wife. Church officials wrung their hands, they feared secret marriages, claimed promises were made, then denied. They issued canon laws and decrees, and insisted that priests be present, that banns be read in advance, announcements of the union, so that any objections could be raised. But life in the countryside didn't always allow for such formality. Priests were few, roads were long, some villages only saw a cleric every few weeks, and people did what they had always done. They trusted each other, and their memories, and their word. Not everyone followed the rules perfectly. Some couples married, despite bans, some ignored degrees of kinship, some married twice, some never married, but lived as if they had, and the church, it adapted, slowly, sternly, but with an understanding, however reluctant, that a rule written in Latin did not always replace a practice rooted in need. In time, marriage would become more rigid, the church would win more ground, but in this moment, the Middle Ages, as most lived them, there was space between law and life, and in that space, people made promises, not always perfectly, not always legally, but meaningfully. Two hands clasped, a simple vow, and a shared loaf of bread, that for many was the true beginning, and in most cases, it was enough. Forbidden matches and elopements. Every village had its rules, and every village had its rebels. In a world so tightly bound by duty, family, land, law, and the church, love didn't always follow the paths laid out for it. Sometimes it ran alongside the furrows, sometimes it crossed them, barefoot and breathless, in the dark. Forbidden matches were nothing new. You could fall in love with a cousin too close by blood, and the priest would say no. You could whisper vows with someone promised to another, or fall for a servant, a widow, a foreigner, a bastard, a monk who had left the order, a merchant's daughter, a tanner's son, and the answer from your kin, or your lord, or the law, was often the same. You may not, but people have never been so easy to contain. They met in secret, in stables, by riverbanks, behind hedgerows, at market stalls, in the candle-lit corners of inns where no one asked questions, and there hearts beat too fast, and hands brushed too long, and futures were imagined in bold silence. Sometimes they waited for parents to change their minds, waited for a betrothal to be broken, waited for a death to make space. But sometimes they ran. Elopement was not common, but it wasn't unheard of. Two people might vanish for a night, or three. They might be found, or they might return claiming they had already spoken vows, handfasted, sworn themselves to one another in private, before God alone. And if neighbors had seen it, if even one or two had nodded in agreement, then the church, reluctantly, might have to accept it. That's what made these unions so powerful, and so dangerous, because even without a priest or a blessing, words once spoken could not be easily undone, and if they had truly meant them, the couple could be bound for life. Of course, it didn't always end in happiness. Some who eloped were dragged back in shame, some were separated by force, sent to different towns, different homes, some faced penance, others silence, and many simply faded into stories, warnings, whispers passed from mother to daughter, do not be foolish like her. But some made it work. They carved out a life, maybe smaller than the one they imagined, maybe quieter, but theirs. The church kept writing new rules, lords and fathers kept setting conditions, but love, stubborn, awkward, inconvenient, kept finding ways around them. In the end, these stories rarely made it into the records. They lived instead in songs, in folded letters, in the memories of neighbors who remembered seeing two figures walking arm in arm down a path they shouldn't have taken. Not all marriages began with permission. Some began with risk, and in those rare moments, when two people stepped across the line together, they changed more than their own future. They reminded the world, in soft defiance, that hearts often outrun rules. Marriage without the church's blessing. Not every marriage came with incense. Not every couple stood beneath a cross. Not every vow echoed from stone chapels or was spoken beneath the gaze of saints. Some marriages happened quietly, and some happened without the church at all. You wouldn't always notice them. Not right away. They lived in homes set just outside the village, in the far corner of a hamlet, where the priest only visited once a season, in places where hands mattered more than hymns, where survival left little room for ceremony. These were unions born not from doctrine, but from need, trust, and often love. The church had strong feelings about such things. Canon law was clear, especially as the Middle Ages wore on. A marriage needed witnesses, consent, public acknowledgement, and eventually, it needed a priest's blessing. Otherwise it risked being called concubinage, sin, or worse, nothing at all. But out in the countryside, the lines weren't always so firm. Two people might pledge themselves to each other with clasped hands, eyes steady, promises spoken just once. Before friends, before family, before no one but each other. And if they meant it, if they truly meant it, it counted. Even if no priest ever heard the words. They worked together, slept beside each other, raised children, shared tools, debt, sickness, and salt. For all intents and purposes, they were married, and often the village agreed. Because what mattered, truly, was not the ceremony, it was the commitment that followed. Some of these couples did eventually marry in the church, years later, when a priest was near, or when inheritance needed sorting. Others never did, and that created complications. Children born of such unions were sometimes deemed illegitimate. Property passed awkwardly. Disputes could rise when one partner died, and the other had no paper to prove what everyone already knew. They were each other's. Still, people made their choices. Not out of defiance, always, but out of circumstance. Maybe they couldn't afford a church wedding. Maybe one had been married before, and annulment was out of reach. Maybe their love moved faster than the formalities could catch. Whatever the reason, they lived on. Their homes were filled with the same smells, wood smoke, cabbage stew, sheep's wool drying near the hearth. Their days were filled with the same chores, spinning, milking, mending, bargaining, praying, and their nights, just as quiet, just as long, just as tangled in dreams. The church grumbled, preachers warned, decrees were issued, repeated, enforced, but people kept living. Because not all vows needed altars, some were carved into calloused hands, into the silence of long evenings, into the soft language of daily care. And long after the priests had passed, and the records forgotten, those marriages, unsanctioned, unblessed, were still remembered. Not by heaven perhaps, but by neighbors, by children, by those who knew what it looked like when two people chose each other every day, even without permission. What makes a marriage valid? You might think the answer is simple. Ask a bishop, and he would give you Latin. Ask a village priest, and he might pull out a scrap of canon law, or at least quote it from memory. Ask the couple themselves, and they might simply look at each other. So what did make a marriage valid in the Middle Ages? Not one thing, but several, woven loosely together. First, consent. This was central. The church insisted that both bride and groom had to agree freely. No force, no trickery, no father handing over his daughter without her word. In theory, that was enough. Two people could stand before witnesses, speak their vows, and if they truly consented, the marriage existed, even if no priest ever blessed it. That terrified the church. It meant couples could marry in secret, without bans, without oversight, without the structure of ritual or supervision. And so, as the centuries rolled on, the church tried to tighten its grip. Second, public vows. The church wanted marriage out in the open, visible, verifiable, announced. That meant bans read in the parish 3 Sundays before the wedding, giving anyone time to object, whether for kinship, pre-existing betrothals, or old secrets. It also meant a ceremony, ideally in a church, ideally in daylight, ideally with a priest standing between the couple and the altar. Third, witnesses, at least 2, not just to confirm the words were spoken, but to guard against later denial, a protection for women especially, in a world where a man might walk away and say, "It never happened." But even then, it wasn't always enough. Some couples eloped, some whispered vows in corners or behind hedgerows. Some lived as man and wife for decades with no priestly word, and when challenged, pointed to their neighbors and said, "Ask them, they saw, they know." And most of the time, that was enough. So what else mattered? Sometimes, nothing more than the shared life itself. If they lived together, worked together, bore children, raised goats, harvested barley, and took turns tending the fire, wasn't that, in its own way, a marriage? The law might disagree, the church might shake its head, but the village nodded, because marriage to most people was not a thing sealed with a ring or words in Latin. It was waking up and choosing the same face again. It was passing the bread across the table, mending the same torn shirts, surviving the same winter. So what made a marriage valid? Maybe it was consent, Maybe it was ritual, maybe it was law, maybe it was love, but for most, it was endurance. Two hands still reaching for each other after the hard days, a quiet yes, repeated in the doing, again and again and again. Bonds that could not be broken. They sat together by the hearth, not speaking, not touching, just sitting. The stew had long gone cold. The fire was little more than coals, glowing softly in the dark. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden shutters. Inside, everything was still. They had been married 22 years. Not by choice, exactly. Not in the romantic sense, not with fluttering hearts or songs beneath their window, but by arrangement, the way most were. She was 17, he was 24. Two families needed one another. Two small plots could be made into one. And so it was done. The priest had spoken the words, and they had both repeated them. The witnesses nodded. Someone clapped the groom on the back. Someone handed the bride a piece of honeyed bread. That was the beginning. And then came everything else. There were good years, years with decent harvests, when the goats were healthy and the salt peddler came early and the children laughed without coughing. And there were hard years, sickness, frost, debts, the boy they buried in spring. And through all of it, they stayed married. Not because they had no troubles, but because they had no choice. In the eyes of the church, marriage was not just a partnership, it was a binding, a vow not made to each other alone, but to God, and once made, it could not be taken back. There were no divorces, not really, not for common folk. There were no second chances, no fresh starts in a new village, no quiet papers signed in a clerk's hall. Once you were wed, that was it. To leave your spouse while they still lived was not just a scandal, it was a sin. It could cost you your place in the church, your reputation, your shoal. So even when the love faded, or was never quite there to begin with, the marriage remained. Neighbors understood. They saw the silences, the way she turned her head when he spoke, the way he spent long evenings in the shed with the tools, longer than he needed to. They knew, but they never said much. Everyone had something they lived with. There were stories, of course, stories of annulments, of marriages undone, because they were never true to begin with, but those were rare. You needed proof, connections, clergy who would listen. For peasants in hamlets, where the priest came twice a year and barely knew their names, such things might as well not exist. So instead, they endured, and over time, endurance became something like companionship. He learned to take the edge out of his voice. She learned to sit beside him, even when there was nothing left to say. They shared chores, shared pain, shared the quiet understanding of two people who had seen everything fall apart and still woken up the next day to feed the animals. That was the shape of many marriages. Not always love, not always joy, but something solid, something that lasted, because in a world where so little could be counted on, not the weather, not the grain, not even your own health, there was this one thing that would not break, not easily, not even under strain. A vow spoken long ago, still echoing faintly every time two people looked across the room and remembered, we are still here, together. Love that grew with the seasons. In the first year, she didn't know what to say to him. He was quiet, and so was she. Not cold, just careful. Two strangers joined not by choice, but by arrangement. Their families had spoken. The priest had blessed it, and so they were husband and wife. The cottage had only one room. The bed was straw. The roof leaked near the door. They spent most days working, she at the loom, he in the field. In the evenings, they ate what little there was, and slept without touching. The seasons turned. Spring brought mud and calves and blisters. Summer brought sweat, long days, and nettle stings. Autumn meant the flurry of harvest. Winter was silence, broken only by the sound of kindling, snapping, and soup bubbling on the hearth. They didn't talk much, but they listened. He noticed how she hummed to herself while hanging clothes. She noticed how he ran his hand over the doorframe every time he came in, as though checking it for strength. Their rhythm built slowly. By the second year, she knew how he liked his bread, thick crust, no salt. He knew she hated waking early, unless there was a fire already going. He began starting it before dawn. She left his cloak by the door when it rained. It wasn't romance, not in the way ballads spoke of. There were no love letters, no grand gestures, but something was growing. In the third year, when she fell ill, he sat by her side for 3 nights, barely sleeping. He spooned broth into her mouth with shaking hands. She didn't say thank you, but when she recovered, she mended his boots before he could ask. He kissed her forehead one morning without thinking. Neither spoke of it, but both remembered. By the 5th year, they could tell what the other was thinking, just by the way they moved. He knew her silences. She knew when he needed rest. They laughed more, though never loudly. The kind of laughter that belonged only to the people who knew how hard life could be. Their first child came in the 6th year. He held the baby like something too sacred to touch. She watched him, eyes wide, heart full in a way she didn't expect. That night, she reached for his hand beneath the blanket, and didn't let go. The years passed. Together they buried her father, then his. They rebuilt the roof. They lost 2 goats to sickness, and nearly lost each other to fever. He taught the children to carve wood. She taught them to weave stories into their work. And through it all, the love kept growing. Not in leaps, not in fire, but like ivy, quiet, steady, clinging to the walls of their life. In their old age, they sat together beneath the tree behind the cottage, watching the wind move the wheat. He would point out clouds, she would braid rushes into small shapes, placing them in his lap. Their love had no beginning. They could point to no spark, no day that changed everything. But it was there, built from seasons, from small gestures, from years of choosing each other when it would have been easier not to, from shared cups and shared grief and shared silence that never needed filling. It was not the love of songs, it was the love of ordinary people, in ordinary lives, who quietly built something extraordinary simply by staying. A life shared until the end. In the last years of their lives, there were fewer words, not because there was less to say, but because so much had already been said, or understood, or lived. They didn't need to speak to know when the other was tired, or hungry, or aching. They simply knew. Their days had become simple. He rose slowly in the morning, stirred the fire back to life, and waited until she woke. She would sit by the window with her basket of mending, not because there was much left to fix, but because her fingers still remembered the rhythm. He carved bits of wood, more out of habit than purpose. They didn't work the fields anymore, that had passed to their children, now grown. The cottage, once filled with voices and crumbs and scattered tools, was quiet, but not empty. There was always a pot on the hearth. Even if it only held water and herbs, there were still shoes by the door. His, hers, still a shared blanket, mended again and again. Sometimes she would reach out and rest her hand on his knee without looking. Sometimes he would bring her a cup without asking if she was thirsty. That was what love looked like now, not a beginning, not even a middle, but the long slow echo of years layered together until they became one life, one story. They remembered their wedding now only in pieces. The way the light had hit the floor in the chapel, the rough feel of the wool cloak she wore, the nervous way he had held her hand when the priest spoke. She had thought then that they were strangers, tied by duty. He had thought the same, but time had changed that. What once felt like fate had become a choice, made again and again, in moments large and small. When they forgave, when they waited, when they stayed, and now, near the end, those choices felt like stones in a path, placed carefully, one by one, to lead them home. When the end did come, it came in winter. He passed first, quietly, while she slept in the same bed they had shared since the beginning. No pain, no struggle, just stillness, like a breath held too long. She found him in the morning, his face turned toward her, as if he had been watching. There were tears, yes, but not only for loss, also for gratitude, for the years, for the life, for the vow that had outlived its ceremony and become something deeper. She stayed a little while longer, long enough to feel the sun warm the window again, long enough to whisper to him once more, as though he was still listening. When she too passed on, the village buried them side by side. There were no grand markings, no carvings of angels, just a stone, 2 names, the years between. But those who had known them remembered more. They remembered how they stood in the same place every festival, shoulder to shoulder, how they never left a gathering until they'd found each other's eyes, how their love had not come all at once, but slowly, like moss on stone, patient, steady, enduring. And so the story ended not with a kiss or a flourish, but with a hand still resting gently on the other's sleeve, a marriage, not of legend, but of life, a life shared until the end.